Full disclosure, Slaughterhouse Five by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. is one of my favorite novels to both teach and to read. He was born in 1922 and lived until 2007, and he's a somewhat quasi-author in Slaughterhouse Five because he presents himself as part of the text, but also as a fictional character. In World War II, he was a prisoner of war during the Battle of the Bulge, and this is really important in the text because a lot of the text is an allegorical reflection of the experience that he had then. And on December 14th, 1994, he was sent to Dresden. He studied anthropology in the University of Chicago. Unfortunately, his thesis was rejected, but you see anthropology throughout this text as he mines throughout what it means to be human. He became a writer and published Slaughterhouse Five in 1968, and this was at the peak of the anti-war movement, and this is really important. This made him very successful and a guru figure in the post-60s literary field. In terms of the Dresden bombing, February 13th and 14th, 1945, it's estimated that there were between 130,000 to 250,000 deaths, and almost all of them were civilians. And so this was part of a massive attack coded as Thunderclap, which targeted the German cities of Berlin, Dresden, Leipzig, and Schmenitz. So there's some irony here because Dresden is not a strategic point in any sense of the word. There's no factories, there's no railways, no bridges, but there were tons and tons of POWs, and this made their deaths even more meaningless. If you've read Chronicle of a Death Foretold, you are used to a nonlinear narrative. Gabriel Garcia Marquez uses the same device as Vonnegut Jr. So time traveling is really important. Even though this text is set historically, there's 4 clear segments of Billy Pilgrim's life. There's 1922, his childhood, 1944, his World War II years, and 1968, his post-war life as a family man and an optometrist in New York. There's also mixed in his capture by aliens who come from the planet Tralfamadore. As we get into the text, we'll examine what that actually means. But these sections are all intercut in order to create somewhat of an effect of confusion and disembodiment. Now, Vonnegut has some great advice for short story writing. This is what he says. Number 1 is to use the time of a total stranger in such a way that he or she will not feel the time was wasted. 2, give the reader at least one character that he or she can root for. 3, every single character should want something, even if it is only a glass of water. Number 4, every sentence must do one of 2 things: reveal character or advance the action. Number 5, start as close to the end as possible. Number 6, be a sadist. Make awful things happen to your main characters so your readers can see what they're made of. Number 7, write to please just one person. Number 8, give your readers as much information as possible as soon as possible. To heck with suspense. Number 9, break the rules. Everyone writes differently, but don't break rules. Number 1 or 7. You can see he's got a hint of humor in his writing, but also realism. So we begin the novel with chapter 1 with a few questions. So why does the author discuss how he gets to write this novel? And there is an inquiry. Even the first sentence of the text makes us wonder who the writer is and what his purpose is in writing this story. And what are the views of the war, history, and life does he introduce here? Can we trust this narrator? So the frame of the story is established here. In the novel, the author makes the claim to reality. However, we can see this is contradicted by his own narrative tone. He also discusses his inability to write, how the novel is set up or prepared for, and it talks about Dresden in its context. So there's 2 arguments here, for writing and against writing. So for writing, Dresden is worse than Hiroshima, but it received very little publicity, relatively speaking. And he's obsessed throughout the text, and you'll see this obsession coming out with all kinds of different examples. And against the writing, so anti-war, 1968, this was a really interesting movement, is a little bit like being anti-glacier or anti-death. It's a little hard to do both of those. And O'Hare's wife is writing books encouraging wars, and Lot's wife is looking back through the text. So from historical perspectives, history is not progressive. My question to you is history linear? So life can be seen in this text as a dark comedy. So you'll see that the author is self-belittling. you'll see that he's emphasizing the concept of life's transience. And this catchphrase throughout the novel, "So it goes," is often repeated to remind us that this is just the nature of things. And again, on page 2, "If the accident will," there's almost a fatalistic perspective in the text. An article written by James Parker 50 years later in The Atlantic, he says that he appreciates the exalted brokenness of the novel, and I think this is a really good way to look at this postmodern text in terms of how the fragmented narrative comes together. And Vonnegut, when he was speaking to Playboy in 1973, says, "I suppose that flowers, when they're through blooming, have some sort of awareness of some purpose having been served," he mused horticulturally. "Flowers didn't ask to be flowers, and I didn't ask to be me. At the end of Slaughterhouse 5, I had the feeling that I had produced this blossom, so I had a shutting off feeling, that I had done what I was supposed to do and everything was okay, and that was the end of it." I hope you enjoy beginning this novel and reading it throughout, and I hope you'll reflect back on where he came from and how he created a context for one of my favorite novels. Thank you.